Good morning, all. It's 10 o'clock. Good morning to my advisory board friends. I hope everybody is well. We've got lots to talk about and review, so let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, Kate. You want to walk us through a roll call?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. So I have a few folks that I know will not be on the call today, but we'll start. Sheriff Adams will not be on. Tom Alvin.
Here.
Good morning. Dr. Anderson.
Here.
Dr. Arlotto is here. Karen Bailey.
Here.
James Bell.
Good morning.
I see Megan Berger. Good morning. Claire Cabral.
Here.
Good morning. Dr. Coleman. Delegate Ebersol will not be here today. Dave Engel. Pam Gaddy.
I'm here.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Captain Herring. Dr. Hoover will not be here today. Chief Keifer. Chief, we do not see you. Senator Klausmeyer. Okay. Laurel Moody.
I'm here. Good morning.
Oh, there you are. Good morning. Lee Oppenheim.
I'm here. Good morning.
Good morning, Lee. Secretary Padilla will not be here today. Manfred Reek. I do not see Manfred. Detective Smith. Nick Shockney, I believe I saw you.
Morning.
Good morning. Scott Tiffin. And Andrew Tress.
Here. Good morning.
Good morning. And I believe that's everyone. I don't know. Oh, we've got Claire. Claire, you're just on phone, correct?
Yes, I'm trying to join from my computer, but my school is experiencing a Wi-Fi outage. So I will try to access it when it comes back online.
All right, thank you.
But I'm still here.
And I see Detective Smith just joined us, or is joining us. All right, Dr. Arlotto, back to you.
Thank you, Kate. Dawn, if I count correctly, we have a quorum.
I believe we sure do. Before we get started, I did want to offer to you, and as chair of this fine board, it's not on our agenda, but if folks do want me to do a quick legislative rundown on some items of interest, I am happy to do that once we finish the other business that's on the agenda. So that's up to you all.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dawn. Let's see where we are with time as we get through this, but I think that would be very beneficial. I think everybody would appreciate that update. So thank you.
Yep.
All right. We have a quorum. The agenda was sent in advance with the slides that Kate will walk us through today to help us with our discussion, hopefully some decision making. Are there any additions or changes to the agenda? And I will look for hands as opposed to, if you'll raise your electronic hand, if anybody has any changes or suggested changes or additions to the agenda. Not seeing any, can I have a motion to approve today's agenda as printed?
So moved.
I think that Tom, thank you. Second?
I'll second that, Dr. Lotto. Detective Smith.
Thank you, Detective Smith. We have a motion and a second. Any additional conversation on that? Fantastic. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Thank you. Any opposed? Great. We'll move forward. Thank you all. We'll move forward with today's agenda. Kate, let me turn things over to you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Arlato. So as you know, for the last several meetings, we've been working, the board has been working to identify gaps and opportunities in school safety. So we're going to get through those. There have been some minor updates, or a couple of them. We added a few new recommendations, modified a couple of existing ones following the discussion from your last meeting. So if at any point there is concern or disagreement, please jump in. You know, if there's anyone who feels that a particular recommendation needs to be modified even more, we can certainly do that. So we're here on the timeline. We're about halfway through. The expectation is we'll have, for the March meeting, should have a report, sort of a draft outline of a report of recommendations for you all to start looking at, so you can sort of visualize what this will look like as a presentation for the sub-cabinet. So during the discussion today, we have a few questions that will be posed to each of you in regard to each of the observations and recommendations. The first is what sort of implementation would this recommendation be? Would it be a local and/or state implementation? Would it require a work group or a task force or anything like that? The second question is, would it require a change in legislation that exists or regulation as it exists now, or would it require new legislation or regulation? Again, these would be recommendations provided to the sub-cabinet. Would there be funding required? And if so, if there would be funding required, is there an estimate that you all can come up with for how much that funding might be? And then finally, what priority level would this be? Is this a low, medium, high? Is this something we really should begin immediately, or is it something that can be done at a later time? So the first observation that you all identified is it is unclear if legislation and actions and efforts are making improvements in school safety. If you recall, originally, there was a recommendation related to conducting a survey or modifying existing surveys. Given the conversation from the last advisory board meeting, this was modified to fund a research study of state collected data to determine the impacts of the Safe to Learn Act efforts on school safety. So my question to the group, does this better fit and align with given your conversation from the December board meeting? Any concerns here? So obviously this would not require legislation or regulation, at least not initially. It would require funding. So the identification of funding would be necessary. It also would require probably a collaborative effort on various entities at the state level, certainly some participation at the local level, depending on what research data is gathered. But are there any, does anybody on the advisory board have a concern or issue with the way this recommendation was reworded? And if I'm assuming silence means no, everyone's good? Okay, great. So observation 2 was related to COVID and the impact it had on students and staff. The recommendation 2.1 was to develop or expand informational practices and training to educate stakeholders, including students, staff, parents, and parents on behaviors of concern. So would this require any funding? Would this be an implementation at the local level, at the state level, some combination? Oops, sorry. Any? Did my screen change? I'm trying to pull up the notes that were included in your handouts. Can you all see the notes section as well? It's probably really small, but
Yes.
all right. I want to make sure I have that in there.
Where's my end?
So Claire, if you recall at the last meeting, this is one of the areas that you had recommended the student focus group could participate to assist in the development of training of our, at least on the student side. Karen?
My only comment on the recommendation is maybe we also include community leaders, and by that maybe your local health department, your local sheriff's office. You know, I know in our school system we are seeing a lot inside the schools that is originating outside the schools. So I appreciate the fact that it's student, staff, parents on behaviors, but maybe also, you know, people in the community so that they are also aware of how outside actions are having effects on inside our buildings.
And so Karen, what does implementation for that look like? How do you envision that implementation?
You know, I mean, on our side, we have a partnership with, you know, our superintendent, our sheriff, and our chief health officer. You know, they meet monthly and just look at trends, whether it be opioid use, arrests, gun violence, all those things. So we in the schools are prepared for it. And then if we see anything that's happening, then the health department can be prepared for it as well.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Anderson?
So Kate, I would just say, I see this as sort of two different possibilities, one that would require a lot of funding and one that might not require funding really much at all. One would be for the center to develop training materials that could be available for districts or communities to use as they choose, which I think would be relatively low cost, or one would be to provide training because, you know, across the state or whatever, and then I think that's a much more involved cost.
So when you say training, is there a delivery format that would be most beneficial? So if the center were to develop some materials directly, is there some format of delivery that would be most useful?
I mean, I think it could look like a number of different things. I think like when you look at what we do as districts already, for example, so in Anne Arundel, we have a partnership with some of the Kate, you muted me. Is that on purpose?
No, I don't think if I did, I apologize. I did not do it on purpose.
Anyway, we do some partnership things with like our mental health agency here in Anne Arundel. You know, we could certainly do like a parent night or a community night. You could also offer training to, I know in our district, we have a number of churches that are very active in various communities. And so perhaps offering a training to them would be a way that we would look to do it in our, you know, within our community. I think I like the idea of having materials available and then sort of each district could or community could choose what was useful to them. But, you know, I mean, could it be an in-person? Could it be a virtual? I mean, I think we've seen the benefits of some virtual. I think, you know, certainly that could be one medium of delivery. I don't know if, you know, you could also have a videotaped one that was available for people to watch. I don't know how engaging that is, you know, but it wouldn't have to be all in person in my mind. And maybe the center would offer one recorded training that would be available to people. You know, I mean, that might be something that the center could offer versus just making the materials available. So, but.
Great, thank you. Dr. Arlato?
Thank you. I was just going to follow the brilliant points that Dr. Anderson brought forward. That's I was thinking very similarly that informational practices, pushing information out, is certainly something that we can do and very low cost. But depending on the format of the trainings, could be costly, and it's something that the school districts will have to think about.
And from a cost perspective, Dr. Arlato, are you referring to the delivery or the getting the individuals in the seats to participate, or a combination of both?
Absolutely a combination of both. It really depends on, are we talking about training staff to then deliver some information and training to their students or to their families? It really depends on the format, but I think it's both.
James?
Yeah, I want to touch on that. Plus, what most of what Karen was talking about, as far as getting community leadership involved, it'd be nice if there was a platform that was more provided, in which, because each school district or even each school could be dealing with different things, and they might have the ability to handle their situations or have handled their situations. But it would be nice if we could look like, okay, this school is similar to our school. We could actually go to this platform and see what they did and how they did it, and see if those practices would be helpful for us as far as what community leaders did in the area. Because sometimes it's not just us as a school need to see it. Maybe our church members or our other our sheriff offices or something like that could see, like, oh, well, here's how this department handled that community issue that was going into the school. That's a great idea. I think we could do something similar. But if you don't have access to see what other people are doing, it's, a shared idea, I think, would be a great idea.
Great, thank you. All right, so what I'm hearing is putting together content, making that available to schools and school systems, having some consideration related to the funding and costs associated with those delivering those trainings, and then a resource that could be, I'm assuming, an online resource that could be available to schools and school systems and their communities in regard to not just the training itself, but the handling of individual situations within either communities or schools or school systems. Did I capture everything? Did I miss anything? Okay, great. Any other comments on 2.1? Claire?
One last little thing I'd like to add is that for the trainings developed for students, I think it would be, again, I see the note at the bottom, but really beneficial to develop those through the MCSS student focus group. Mm-hmm. We have a committee that was created that is working on things similar to that. And if not this year, then next term, that committee will be really strongly established. And I'd love to see some perspective and collaboration from those student experts at the state level, because in terms of that student population, that perspective would be represented in the creation of those presentations and those resources.
Great, thank you, Claire. Any other feedback on 2.1? Are there any particular needs? So Lee and Tom, I'll go to you both from the private and non-public school side. Are there any particular, are there any individual or specialized needs for either the non-public special education facilities or the private schools?
Do you want to go first?
Sure. I was going to ask you that. I think as long as we're at the table when the development of the information is happening, or reaching out to those who have the expertise with our populations to make sure both from the student side and the parent side and staff as well. That's very important.
Yeah, and I would just add, at least speaking for our schools in the non-public sector, we would want to also focus on parents as well. Because one of our issues with COVID has historically been, we get a lot of friction because parents believe they should have more say in the protocols because they pay tuition. And it's been very challenging.
All right, thank you both. Any additional comments on 2.1? All right, I'll move to 2.2, which is continue efforts that communicate the impact of trauma and the need for trauma-informed care. I think there are certainly resources that the Department of Education is putting forth. I know that these are efforts also happening at the local level, but is there something else that needs to be tied to this? Is there dedicated resources of funding and or either at the local, state, or federal level that should be identified? Or are there particular are there resources that are needed for both the public schools as well as non-public and private schools? Are you getting all of the available resources to be able to implement trauma-informed care, trauma-informed training in your schools? Understanding no one will turn down money if it exists. Dr. Anderson?
I feel like there's a lot of different resources out there, and I think MSDE may even have some. Is it just possible to add it? I was just looking at your website, like maybe it could be a separate, you sort of have these like big blocks like school resource officers, mental health resources. Maybe it could just be a big block on your page as a link to other resources.
Coach Bell?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of resources out there for a lot of districts and what's going on, even with just the state and the call lines. I think the advertisement of it sometimes gets lost where, we have a lot of individuals that just don't know it's available. And I think the different ways of, between Instagram and YouTube and, podcasts, whatever, I think there's got to be more ways to put it out there socially, find out what people are looking at, so they actually are more aware that, hey, we do have this if you would like it. And, a lot of stuff doesn't cost you anything. And I think a lot of people assume that, they got to rely on their insurance to go to a doctor to get things done, where we have all these things put in place for them.
So it's less of a lack of resources, existing resources, and more of awareness that those resources exist. Dr. Anderson, did you have something else to add or no? Okay. So moving to 2.3, this is slightly modified from the December presentation. So this is modified to conduct an assessment of health curriculum, substance abuse, suicidal ideation across the state to ensure consistency of curriculum statewide. In the December meeting, apologize, the sun's in my face. In the December meeting, there was discussion around the need for ensuring that health curriculum contains all of these resources, but then the conversation moved to that it's unclear if there's consistency across the state. In other words, that health curriculum is being delivered in the same manner across the state. So first question is that an accurate description, would it be valuable to do an assessment across the state of health curriculum to ensure that it's addressing these areas? Would that be worthwhile? Would it be not, is it not necessary because it is consistent across the state? Dr. Arlotto?
That's the question that I would ask Kate. Is there an indicator that it is not being taught? So we have state standards in each curricular area, including health education, and those standards need to be met in the curriculum at each of the local jurisdictions. Is there an indication that that is not happening?
So that's where the conversation went in the last board meeting. So I'll leave that to the board. Is there an indication that it is not consistent across the state, that there should be an assessment?
Or I guess I'm just gonna just sort of toss this out there. Is there something that you all would want to see in terms of how it's implemented, right? Not that it isn't being done, but how it's being implemented that would determine the depth of the content, the amount of time that is spent on it by each jurisdiction, and whether there's variation on that, because that is something that is left up to the local school system. So there may in fact be variation about that over time. So what metrics would you want to see in order to better understand what's being done across the board in each school system?
Claire?
This is just a point of clarification I'm curious about. Would it be possible for us to send out a survey to students asking them if they're receiving adequate coverage in these topics? Because I know, at least within my school, which has worked well, our health teacher sent us a survey to fill out asking if we felt like topics were adequately covered. And the results were pretty staggering. A lot of people did say no, as we see in this recommendation. And so it was just kind of to gauge our perspective on the health curriculum. And I think that could help us identify weak areas in terms of what we're looking to address, but I don't know how feasible that would be. And if enough students would willingly take that, and if we could implement that in every single county in the state of Maryland. But that's just a thought.
And
You mean the survey? Survey the students, is that what you meant?
Yes, that's what I meant.
Claire, I just wanted to follow up, since some of this came up during the last month's student focus group meeting that we had that I got to participate in, which was great. That there were questions or concerns that were raised by some of the members regarding the extent to which certain portions of the health curriculum were being taught with respect to sexual health education and consent and other issues surrounding that. And you know, there definitely seemed to be, and you can probably speak to this better than I can, but concerns from the students that that was not equal across the board, depending on where you.
Yes.
Any other comments?
Delegate Ebersol's in the waiting room, if someone can let him in.
I made it. Thank you.
Oh, there you are.
Yep.
All right. So the last recommendation for observation 2 is to expand the use and awareness of Safe Schools Maryland throughout all Maryland schools. So that's certainly an initiative we're already working on. But certainly open to suggestions, recommendations from this board on other ways that we can do that. We have a quiet group this morning. Yes, Claire.
I kind of feel like I'm a broken record repeating things about the student focus group. And maybe this is something that we can do if it's not something we can do as a board, but I found a lot of success in the school safety chapter I started at my school. I know that's a program that was implemented last year within MCSS. I don't know how many other schools are doing it, but if there's any way to promote that and to further that connection across the state, I'd really love to see that. I have found so much success in my school, and we're really working to promote the tip line and the Safe Schools Maryland and everything that stands for. We've put posters up around the school, we've created announcements, and I think so many new students within my school at least understand how it works, knows what it's about. And again, I think that would be something to look into, just the promotion of those chapters. It's worked really well for my school. I'm really trying to encourage other people to implement it as well. Again, maybe that's more of a student focus group issue, but when I think in terms of this recommendation, that would probably be one of the most specific points I would bring up in addressing this for sure.
Great, thank you. Any other input or comments on recommendation 2.4? All right. Claire, did you have another one?
Sorry, one last thing. I think also increasing social media presence as well would definitely be something easy to do and to implement in terms of our output. I've noticed there's some inactivity on the page. There's some posts here and there and some from the student focus group as well, but I think the continuous promotion of the tip line and different posts about it would increase awareness in that regard and our online presence as well. I found that to be pretty successful in terms of reaching a larger population and one of the easiest ways to do so.
Great, thank you, Claire. All right, moving ahead. Recommendation or observation 3 was a mechanism to fill gaps in human resources, including educators, crisis intervention, basically across the board. So the modified, we had a couple of recommendations here that we've sort of rolled up into one. And that is develop recommendations and strategies for filling gaps in staffing at the state and local levels. So there's already some work happening to figure out, to deal with licensing, especially across the state. There's work going on in expanding relationships with universities. So are there other, outside of the bullets that are included here, which are identifying potential financial incentives, whether that's tuition assistance or loan forgiveness? Are there other recommendations that we can include as we build out this particular recommendation as far as bullets, as items, as ways that we can fill these human resource gaps that we're experiencing across the board?
So it doesn't take me long to get ramped up, Kate, sorry. Even if I come in late. So just so you know, you will want to look for legislation and see how you feel about it. I am going to put in legislation that would treat school mental health workers, psychologists and social workers at all in a similar fashion, the way the blueprint does in terms of attracting them into the schools and keeping them there, giving them a career pathway. It's going to be a heavy lift to get the bill passed, but if MCSS would see fit to offer support for that, once you take a look at it, it's sitting on my desk and hasn't been dropped yet, but it will be soon. You might want to keep an eye out for it. That might be something that might be a future endeavor on this topic. After all the discussion that you guys had to put up with us the other day on SROs, my feeling is that the front end is a very good place to address these issues. Would make the whole thing a little easier. SROs often are on the back end, although some people would argue they do front end work too. But I'm gonna see if we can at least draw attention to the fact that these personnel in schools were largely overlooked in the blueprint, and we need to pay attention to the important role they play. Hopefully, so when the legislation drops, I'm primary sponsor. Keep an eye out for it. I would ask you to do that.
We will. Thank you, Delegate. Manfred, I saw that you joined us. Is there anything creative going on in the staffing of bus drivers? He came in late, so I'm not sure if his audio is working.
He's having connectivity problems.
Is he? Okay. Dr. Arlato?
Yes, I mean, while Manfred is getting connected, there are a number of things happening around the state, not the least of which is some pay has changed for a number to attract and retain drivers and aides across the state in many of the jurisdictions, mine included. There are also the Maryland Motor Vehicle Association is opening up weekend Saturday slots for bus driver only tests. That has always been a challenge in doing the training for drivers at each local jurisdictions and then getting them through the state test, both the written and then the driving portion. And so this past Saturday, as a matter of fact, on the 8th, on the 6th or was that the 5th? The 5th. There was a statewide MVA was opened up to do bus driver only testing at sites, which is really very beneficial. So any and all those things are helping with the attraction and retention of bus drivers.
Any other comments or input on 3.1? Okay. So observation 4 had to do with the collection of data and the reporting of data. It spanned everything from the discussion, spanned everything from the arrest data to bullying data, use of force data, which each of those are collected by different state entities. So, we collect some, the Department of Education collects some, and the need for more consistency across the school systems in the data that they're reporting to limit inaccuracies, consolidate data collection and reporting requirements, so that there's not sort of this redundancy and or added impact to the school systems of providing all of this data that's being collected. So recommendation 4.1 was to conduct an assessment of data that's collected and the collection procedures to determine if there's a way to consolidate some of that data collection and reporting to take some of the pressure off the school systems to make it a little easier. Is that a correct, would that be beneficial? And then is there any concern related to the potential of consolidating some of these data collection points or refining. And if there was an assessment, who would need to be involved in that assessment? Obviously, the state and the school systems, but are there any other entities that should be included? Use of force obviously ties to law enforcement as well as school security. Arrest data obviously ties to law enforcement. Are there any other groups we're missing? Dr. Anderson?
Kate, this is a question I genuinely don't know the answer to. Would some legislation have to change, or some of the data that are collected by specific agencies legislation driven?
So some are legislatively driven, some are driven by regulation. So yes, so those would all have to be, as part of the assessment, right? We would have to look at, is it legislatively mandated? Is it regulatory? And then make a decision if we put forth a recommendation to make modifications to either of those. And can't guarantee they'll go through. If they're regulatory, they'll go to the sub-cabinet if they're sub-cabinet regulations, or they'll go to the Board of Ed if they're education regulations. If they're legislative, obviously that's a different beast altogether.
It seems complicated to me to even try to map out who requires what in what fashion.
I would agree with that. So if it could be done though, then that there is some value in doing that. I'm seeing heads nod, so I'm hoping that's a yes across the board. All right.
And there is some precedent for this, you know, with other data that is collected that is reconciled cross-agency, like the Longitudinal Data System Center has. So it's not that it can't be done. It is being done. It's just a question of adding elements to it and how those would need to be collected in order to have appropriate fidelity to work with the other data points that already exist.
I'm going to switch down to 4.A.1, which is slightly modified because this was brought out in a couple of our your advisory board meetings. So specific to the school arrest data, there is concern that the arrest data that's being reported or gathered and then reported is inconsistent from school system to school system, number one, and is not, well, so that's the first issue. The second issue that was brought up is the arrest data is being collected by or from the school systems as opposed to law enforcement agencies, which can create obviously conflicts and potentially inaccurate data being collected and then reported. So the recommendation here, and again, this was specifically pulled out separately, was to convene a diverse work group to review and modify as appropriate the existing arrest data reporting requirements. And Kelly, to your earlier question, this is one that is specifically tied to regulation. So it's not legislatively mandated, it's driven under the State Board of Education regulations. So it would require, it may, I shouldn't say it would, it may require a change in regulation. The suggested work group was or is MSDE, MCSS, DJS, local school systems, and law enforcement agencies. There was a recommendation to ensure that there's a mechanism to hold the reporting entities accountable for providing the information both accurately and timely. Training, that was brought up in your last meeting, that once whatever the reporting data is going to be, that the entities, both school systems and our law enforcement agencies, are trained on what those reporting requirements are. And then the final comment was to ensure equity across the state, to ensure that it's consistent from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So does that touch on everything that you all remember in your discussion from December? I think we captured everything. I just want to make sure there's nothing that you all see that might be missing. And again, this is specific to the arrest data collection. Megan?
Sure. I wasn't present for the December meeting, and I think this captures it with sort of the focus on ensuring equity and that it's a diverse work group. And obviously this group is, trying to figure out consistency of data. But I do think whenever we're having these conversations, trying to think how to include student voice and the impact of, students and families that are directly impacted by arrest as well, students with disabilities, students of color who bear sort of the disproportionate, arrest. So I want to throw that out there. And I think this does capture it, but in terms of sort of who also to be included in the work group, I would just want to sort of think critically about other groups that could make, provide sort of a meaningful voice to the work group.
Great, thank you, Megan. Any other input or comments? Okay. Observation 5. So schools must implement comprehensive school safety preparedness programs, including assessments, planning, training, exercise, and evaluation. And the recommendations out of this are: number 1, providing consistent funding to schools to support comprehensive preparedness planning training, which includes planning, training, and exercise efforts for all schools, including private and non-public, in addition to obviously public schools. So this was modified slightly. The observation was modified to support comprehensive preparedness, because if you recall, the original one was specific to facility assessments. And I think it goes bigger than that, especially given your conversation in December. So I guess my question for the group is, one of the conversations that came up in December was how much money is enough money, right? And where are the existing gaps? So if the recommendation is to provide consistent funding, what level of funding is enough? And is that a level of funding that is one and done? Is it a level of funding that we identify these gaps and now here are the things we need to fund? Is comprehensive school safety preparedness, assessments, planning, training, and exercise something that should be consistently funded? And should that be consistently funded by potential grants, state funding, other creative sort of ways to do that? Again, if it's consistent funding, it's going to probably require legislative action. But if there's some other mechanism to do that, or some other way to do that. So first question is that a viable modification to the recommendation? So a lot of the funding we do is for equipment versus what we're talking about here, which is the funding of those activities, right, that are in the preparedness realm. Karen?
I guess I agree with recommendation, and maybe, Kate, to your point, to break it down a little bit, maybe I'm assuming that all school systems are at different places in emergency preparedness and school safety measures and things like that. So it's almost as if like the funding, like for instance, if like we use the Raptor system, right, to track visitors in and out. So if there's a school system that doesn't have the funds to do that, then, you know, is there a pot of money that they can draw from? Like, do we just blanket everyone with money, or do we assign specific tags for uses of the money and then have the school systems apply for it as needed? Does that make sense? Rather than just, you know, giving everyone X amount of money.
Yeah, so you're suggesting that it's not, you know, a preset allocation per school system, or if we're talking about our non-public and private schools as well, but rather these are the activities we're doing. We have a need for this particular type of emergency preparedness activity, whether that's we need to do a comprehensive, and hopefully I answer your question, Pam. We do a comprehensive exercise of our emergency plan, or we're at the time where we need to do a facility assessment, but we don't have the resources to be able to do that. So we need funding to be able to support that activity. Did I?
Right. Because you kind of want everyone to begin to get to the same level of, you know, you want everyone on a flat ground, so to speak, when it comes to this. So, you know, if you, and that would mean maybe some school systems would have, you know, a bigger pot of money coming their way than others based on where they are and their, you know, and their school needs. Or if something happens that, you know, they do require a different type of emergency preparedness or safety measure, then that money is available to them and they're not scrambling, you know, to go into their funds or back to their county in order to get it.
Good, thank you. Lee?
I think that works as long as there's some mechanism where the cost of where we want everybody to be is consistent across the board. And so going back to finding out or recommendations for vendors and negotiated pricing across the board, that way people are on that even playing field to get everybody in the same place.
And so I know we talked about that in regards to equipment, right? Mm-hmm. One of the last meetings you had mentioned visitor management systems, but
right.
Do you also mean if there's a need for potential contractor support? Right, so set pricing if a school needed to do or chose to do some sort of agreement with a vendor to help in emergency preparedness activities.
Yes.
Karen?
I have a quick question when Lee was speaking, and I don't know if anyone knows the answer. So do the private schools in Maryland, do they have the benefit of bidding or accepting the contracts and pricing that was provided to public school systems?
No.
So, yes or no?
No.
Okay, well, then maybe that's something else, right? Because if I can go out and use a contract that was negotiated by Prince George's County and get the same pricing through the course of that contract. And if that's something that I have an advantage of as a public school, but the private schools, then, you know, maybe that's something that needs to be incorporated somewhere.
That's what, Karen, what we've been saying for a while. I was researching a service that they were going to charge me $4.50 a student, but they're charging Baltimore County $1 a student. And so we also we don't have the same buckets of funding to do that. So if we can bring all the schools into the level playing field with negotiated rates, obviously I'm not going to cost the same as a school system cost because I don't have the number of students, but at least I'm starting from the same level.
This would require a lot of research on the legality of being able to do that. I mean, I certainly appreciate the whole, you know, the desire, right? But in terms of what can or cannot be done and other barriers that may exist legally to the state and or a county government being the negotiating tool for a procurement for a private entity, that's highly problematic.
But I think also, Don, the other side to it, nothing against the private schools, but we're publicly funded, our students are publicly funded, and we still don't have that same benefit that the public schools do.
Right, I understand, but you're not governed by the local school boards. And again, that creates a different legal complication that's a much bigger discussion than what we can have here, and certainly would require a lot of research and discussion.
Just clarification, we're governed by Maryland State Department of Education in terms of our certifications, in terms of what we can charge our tuition rates. So I think we need, that's why we talked for a while of separating the private schools from the non-public special education schools who are publicly funded.
So to Dawn, to your point, sorry, I'm running this through in my head. So Lee, what I'm hearing is there is no mechanism for a non-public special education facility to piggyback, either legitimately piggyback on a local procurement or contact the vendor and say, my school is in Montgomery County and I know that you're charging Montgomery County Public Schools this much. Can we get whatever X is for that price?
We don't necessarily have the information available to us either. So.
Okay.
Have I used that in negotiating rates? The answer is yes. Has it gotten me very far? Not really.
Okay. And again, that was specific to equipment or
Anything.
human resources for some of the other.
Anything.
Okay.
Like Karen talked about the Raptor system. We have the Raptor system. You know, same thing with our communication systems. We use Crisis Go, other people use Alert Media, but there's no consistency for our schools to piggyback onto the public schools.
Okay.
No offense, Tom, but
None taken.
I mean, if we can get there, maybe we can help them get there too. But, you know, at least I will say, I think a lot of the private schools try to work together and piggyback off of each other, but I don't think we have the same buying power. Is that correct, Tom?
Yeah, absolutely correct.
All right. So that might be a deeper dive into the procurement rules statewide. All right. Any other comments or input on 5.1? Okay, 5.2 was expand preparedness guidance and resources to support comprehensive school emergency preparedness efforts. So one of the suggestions, which is actually something we're already exploring, is a statewide master service contract to allow entities to have access to emergency preparedness or emergency management vendors and contractors to be able to do individual tasks. My hope is that will actually come to fruition, but we're, running through the procurement process, so I can't make any guarantees at this moment. Any input, comments, or concerns about this recommendation? No? Okay. Moving to number 6. So there's a need for more focus on approaches to school safety beyond physical safety and greater consideration of the possible negative impacts of physical safety measures, including security, technology, and personnel. So during the conversation in December, there was actually it was November and December. The recommendation was made to review existing facility security guidance that's out there, whether it's federal and or some other guidance at the private or state level in another state or even within Maryland, and develop recommendations for minimum physical security, including design and technology, that have the least negative effects on students. Now, this was specific to physical security recommendations. In other words, putting together a recommendation that schools should, right, have, for example, the discussion was around vestibules, visitor management system, communication repeaters, and then cameras. So this would obviously require a work group to be put together. If we got into anything related to transportation, we might need additional input from entities. Is there a concern with statewide guidance on minimum standards? Re-looking at that, assessing that, and potentially putting those in place. Karen?
I'm going to jump back on my private school bandwagon. But if we have minimum state standards, how would that impact our non-public schools if they don't meet those standards? And I'm thinking more in the event that something happens, does that open them up to liability? Because now we have this blanket for everyone else, but they don't have the funding or ability to follow.
If I could just, add to that, I think the reality is we're already under that standard. And what I mean by that is, when we have incidents in our schools, oftentimes, particularly when it involves litigation, we're held to what's the customary practice. So if public schools have visitor control or swipe cards or whatever, and we're still using, lock and keys and that's what caused the breach. I mean, we're already, we already have our back up against the wall because, we're in essence being held to the same standard as publicly funded public schools without those funds. And so we just have to do our best to, prioritize those items so that we're already meeting that. And if anything, I think in some respects, having at least a minimum standard that we can compare ourselves to would actually be helpful in many respects, because at least we can say, well, we at least met the minimum standard. So it's a struggle. Absolutely. It's a fair question.
It also having a minimum standard in the interim while we're looking at pricing across the board, having a minimum standard for our schools to get to gives us more of a leverage in trying to find grant funding for them than for us to say we want to do this, I mean, all our kids are kids across the state. It shouldn't really matter where they're going to school. We need to protect them no matter what.
Dr. Arlato?
If there's going to be, and I think this goes without saying, if we're going to advocate for some minimum state standards for facility upgrades, then there needs to be some minimum state funding that goes along with that.
And so if the standards were, so this indicates that they were to be recommendations versus set standards. Would that change the funding needs?
Well, I think everybody would then, I think we'd still be at the same place if there are recommendations that are going to come from Maryland Center for School Safety for schools, both public and private, and non-public. Then I think that the funding needs to be there. The school systems now are piecing it together through grants and trying to piece it together through their own budgets, but it's difficult to keep up with because the technology changes, upgrades need to happen. Just upgrading the Raptor system after a couple of years use is something that's got to occur if you adopt that.
So if there were either guidance and or set standards, so would it be valuable as part of this if the recommendation is to have some sort of guidance or recommendations of standards, that there's then as sort of step 2, once those are set, an assessment of where everything is in the state, where all the school systems are, and then where the non-public and private schools are relative to those standards or that guidance, and then determine an allocation of funding that would be recommended and or needed to address those gaps?
Yes, I think that would be helpful. I think the IEC is doing some of that work now.
Right.
And that always poses an interesting question, because if we provide state funding, those who have been good players that have been moving along will say that they deserve the same funding just because they moved more quickly. They shouldn't be punished by not receiving the same funding that those that need to be brought forward are. So we have to find an equitable way to do that. And we are reluctant from the state level to impose mandates on local government unless we think it's really important, which this is. So we do it sometimes, but you can see Dr. Arlotto sees the dangers right there, right off the bat. Yep.
Lee?
I think we've started to move in that direction a little bit when you look at, for example, when the Safe to Learn Act first came out, there were gaps in funding for us as well as for the private schools. And so now some of those programs are starting to open up a bit more and allow us to get some of the benefit of having funding programs to help us. It's just, there's a lot of hurdles that we have to jump through to get there. And I'm not saying that it's not the same on the public school side, but going back to an even playing field, if we all feel we want to keep our schools and our students safe, then figure out a mechanism to allow everybody to get there. And there are programs that the private schools and the non-public schools are starting to be able to get their hands on. So we've made progress, I think, since 2018. I don't know if Tom agrees or not.
I was just going to add to the discussion, in some respects, what would be very helpful, and just using, for example, the visitor control as one example, it would almost be ideal to say, okay, the cost per pupil on average is $1 or $4 or whatever it is, to understand what is the funding requirement, and then look at, a cost per pupil method. And then if non-public schools, and to Lee's comment, it has gotten better, but in essence, this Safe Schools Act did in some ways create certain standards anyway, many of which we're still struggling to meet because of funding. To me, it would almost be ideal to say, okay, what's by this standard, what do we need to meet that, whether it's so many mental health workers per student, so many whatever per student, what's the cost of that? Then what's the per student cost? And then is it possible that both public and non-public and special needs schools, they get a baseline funding to provide those support and services that all students need, regardless of whether they're in a public or private? So, is it possible that we get assistance with funding of school nurses? We get assistance with helping of funding, school psychologists or whatnot. I appreciate it. We can't get public funding for education, but it seems to me the core, the core competencies to provide the wellness and safety of students, regardless of what school they go to, we should all be able to participate in a public allocation, because ultimately our parents are taxpayers as well. And that would ultimately offset some of the costs that go into our tuition calculations that, then maybe we could benefit them by lowering the tuition. So I think looking at what's the end cost to meet this goal, and then what would that work out to on an estimated per student valuation?
Thank you, Tom. Any other input or comments? Okay. Moving to 6.2 is develop recommendations to address non-physical security approaches to improve the safety of our schools. We have the emergency planning guidelines that the department puts out. We have other, there's national level, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, as well as REMS-TA has a bunch of guidance related to emergency preparedness for schools. Is there also a need to have state level recommendations that go beyond the emergency planning guidelines that go through all phases of the emergency preparedness cycle? In other words, everything from facility assessments to planning to training to exercise to mitigation efforts, all the way through improvement planning. Would that be something that would be beneficial to not just the public schools, but also our non-public and private? And Lee, I see you. Yes.
I think that's one of the things the GSOM project was working on. And I think the missing link with that was the reach out to the schools and the follow through. But yes, I think it's extremely important for that to give that benefit to all of our schools. We have non-public special education schools that don't know where to start. And I'm sure there are private schools who are in the same predicament. And so having some sort of mechanism of, again, baseline, where do we need to go? How do we need to get there is very important. I actually think you have that inconsistency, maybe I'm wrong, between public schools in the same county as well. So I think people, maybe it's not as consistent across the board as we think it is.
Any other input or comments on this? So 6.A sort of pulled out from the one before. Since the onset of the pandemic, there's a need to better ensure cybersecurity of students, schools, and school systems from cyber incidents. So not just specific to general physical safety and security, but our electronic footprints. So provide cybersecurity recommendations, training, and resources to assist schools in conducting cyber assessments. And I think this is meant to be, and develop and train and test cyber response plans. So is that something that would be of value to public schools? I see Tom nodding for private schools. I see Lee nodding. So I know that there are some efforts that are going to be happening at the state level with the Department of Information Technology. I'm not sure exactly what those resources will end up looking like, but there's certainly the opportunity for
It
us.
just becomes a question of where we draw the line on helping these schools provide the services that they are supposed to provide their students. Period. They're private schools.
So this would be resources. So Delegate Ebersol, I understand what you're saying. This would be resources for that could be utilized by public, private, and non-public. Does the fact that it goes to all three, does that change your thoughts on that? Or do you still feel that that is something that the schools should independently have to manage? Or are there components that we could, at the state level, develop as resources?
I guess I just trying to listen to the discussion and understand. So are you asking about like training programs that would be recorded that they could use, or guidance documents that they could use? Or are you talking about going out and having state resources do particular services for the private and non-public schools? Because there's, those are two different things. And, it's one thing if it's like a one size fits all that could be used by all the many people, right? Versus specific services being diverted that are paid for by tax dollars, state tax dollars that go to a private or a non-public school.
Yes, so thank you for asking. So the last meeting, this came up, and it was specific to providing guidance and or documentation and or potentially training, not sending human resources or people into schools or school facilities to conduct any sort of IT assessment. Although that's, if that's a recommendation of the board too, that's a different conversation. But no, it was specific to more guidance documents and training.
I think that, again, my concern is that there are legal concerns here regarding the extent to which the state gets involved with non-public or private schools. There are different pathways within the education article about how each of those schools is managed and or regulated. And this is a much more complicated question than what we can have here today, and would require a fair amount of research and debate. I totally understand and appreciate what everyone's asking for, but again, you don't want to have a state agency say, I'm taking a position that we're going to do X if legally that's not appropriate, right? So, it's good to have the conversation, but there have to be guardrails up, and there has to be a deeper research into the asks that are being made.
Thank you. Karen?
I'm just going to say, from the standpoint of the recommendation, I agree with it. If we go back to look at what happened in Baltimore County, and I think I made this point at the last meeting, the legislative audit arm only comes around once every 7 years. So if there is a document or best practices that we can make reference to in that interim, in order to make sure that our cybersecurity is where it should be, I think that would be beneficial.
And so, Dawn, to address your point, as we put this together, we can include the nuance of, needing to assess what those recommendations might look like, or how robust they could be, or how specific they could be.
Right. Like, these or guidance documents, recommendations, general overall things. There's no issue with that, and with that shared as a resource for others, regardless of whether it's a private or non-public school. It's when you're talking about getting down into more granular things, and or if there's funding that is sought, that is a far different question. And there are concerns about that need to be addressed legally.
All right, thank you. Any other comments? All right. So recommendation or observation 7 was in a need to address and correct inaccurate information which has the potential to inflame tensions. So this is a new recommendation, again, out of the December discussion, and that is develop education and guidance on how to identify and address inaccurate information. This was a difficult conversation, I think, in the last advisory board meeting, because there was no specific recommendation on how we might address inaccurate information or managing inaccurate information. So thoughts on this? Is there, we've had conversations about inaccurate information actually being sent around by students. And so is there a way for school systems or schools to address inaccuracy? Oh, Claire?
I think I mentioned this at our last meeting, but I think developing presentations that identify how specific misinformation can be identified, it's really tough to combat and determine how we can approach misinformation, but teaching others, especially the student population, about how to identify misinformation may be really beneficial. And I think that's something we should focus on in these trainings and programs if we're specifically focusing on presenting them to students.
Thank you, Claire. Tom?
I would just add, and again, I'm kind of focused more on our COVID experience here, but I think there also always needs to be a discernment, whether it's at the state level or county level, but what is going to be considered the authoritative source? Meaning, for example, when it comes to COVID, if you say, well, we're relying on CDC, to many people these days, they're just part of some conspiracy. So I think we just need to be prepared to identify what is going to be our source, and with a justification, not to say people will accept it, but with a clear justification and foundation as to why we've identified that as our source of information. I just think that's an important part of that process.
Great, thank you, Tom. Coach Bell?
Yeah, last part when you said identify the source, I think this is an educational thing, especially on social media. I think we need to do a better job of putting things out there and reaching the proper social media platforms that reach these individuals. So when they find the information, they are getting both sides. Also, that they have a reference to pull back to. So once they get information or they hear this, instead of them immediately spreading what they heard, they say, well, I can go look at this real quick and I can find, all right, this is true or not. So I think our social media platforms, we need to really expand them and be more aggressive on them to educate the individuals.
So just for clarification, so expand education on the use of social media and how to identify information that comes across social media as either inaccurate or accurate or credible. Is that?
Yes, but also expand what we're putting out there on social media.
Okay.
Because a lot of things, I go back to at the beginning of the year, we sit in the classrooms and we go over the rules of the school, right? And the rules, expectations. So when the student milieu says, I didn't know that, you can't say you didn't know that because we went over it for a whole week at the beginning of the school year. The thing is, though, that's to reference that, to say, I don't know if I can do that or not, or even as a parent, when you're looking at that, that's a reading material that's provided at the beginning of the school year, and then really it's never talked about again until you get in trouble. Whereas if we had something that was a little bit easier to reference, that was out there on the platforms that our students are looking at. You know, we used to be big on MySpace, right? But then Facebook took over. Now it's Instagram, now it's TikTok and all that kind of things. I think we just need to put, you know, find the different platforms to put out, you know, the information, the truths of the information, or just the definitions of what we're doing to make it easier for people to reference and say, okay, that's why they did such and such.
And specifically for the official source, correct?
Correct.
Okay, got it. Claire?
To add on to that, I think it's important that students are involved in the creation of these presentations, because oftentimes when schools give presentations about identifying misinformation and social media usage, they're really out of touch with what students are actually using and the things they're doing on social media. So again, this would be a great opportunity to utilize what we have at the state level with the student focus group to give input as to what social medias are being used, how misinformation is being spread, things like that. Because I often find when presentations are given by adults, the intent is good, but the connection is just missing there. So I really think, especially in this instance, it's essential that student opinion is accounted for.
Great, thank you, Claire. Any other comments? All right. 7.2 is a new recommendation: improve or expand digital citizenship education and awareness. So that came up in the last conversation, or the last advisory board meeting. So what does that actually look like? What does expanding digital, like what's currently happening to teach our students in our schools, whether it's, again, public, private, non-public, what are we doing to educate them on their digital footprints, their use of social media? What exists now? Yes, Claire.
At least in my experience throughout elementary and middle school, a lot of digital citizenship education lessons were given through our librarian. Now that I'm in high school, I do not receive those lessons anymore. I'm not sure if that's a result of COVID or just us being in high school. But I do know these lessons were often given 1 to 2 times a year. Some of it would be incorporated into our English curriculum so that we would take tests on the lessons they would give us, and that would be incorporated into our English or language arts grades. I'm not sure how that works for other people around the state, but I do know that remains consistent within my county. I think expanding the frequency of these trainings, I know that's a lot to ask in terms of disrupting typical lesson times, but I think expanding it beyond 1 or 2 lessons per year to maybe like once every 2 months, once every 3 months. I think that may be beneficial, because if we just have them super spaced out, the students don't really remember and recall what information they're being given.
Great, thank you. Coach Bell?
Also, to touch on what Claire said earlier, we probably need to do this for the employees of the school systems too, just so that we keep up to date with the trends of what's going on social media. Because some of our educators are trying to use social media to enhance their class. But once again, if they're out of touch, what they're using won't be effective. So it might be something just not just for the students, but when we do our professional development and stuff like that for the educators, we need to have something for us to understand. All right, this is what's trending now. This is what they're doing. This is how to do what's the good things look out for, the bad things look out for. But I think we definitely need to reach out to the educators.
Is that happening now, either in the public schools or non-public private schools? Education of staff?
I know we have an education. We are definitely educating on how to use the platforms. So we're definitely educating on how to use the platforms. I don't know if we're educating on the trending part of the platforms. So, if someone wants to learn how to use, I don't know, how to set up a TikTok profile, we can teach that. But I don't know if we're reaching out to saying, okay, this is more trending than that. People are still using some of the older platforms to try to reach out, and they're kind of wondering why nobody's reaching back. And that's kind of why we're not staying up with the times.
Claire?
To that point, I think these lessons are being developed again without the inclusion of student perspectives. And even if we incorporated these presentations to be given to staff, it would be made by other adults who may not necessarily understand what's trending on social media and what things are being spread and how they're being spread. So again, I think even if these presentations are being given to staff, it's essential to incorporate student perspective and input, because again, there is a disconnect even if it is a staff-focused presentation.
Great, thank you, Claire. Any other comments? Okay. Number 8, there's unrealistic expectations regarding what law enforcement and educators can do in response to social media threats or posts. The new recommendation, which came out of the last meeting, was to develop guidance on the investigation and response to social media threats made against schools. So given our earlier conversation, this would be potentially a work group that would have to be put together to be able to pull that. This is certainly something that is a conversation happening at the national level, right? Is not only what are we doing in response to these, how are we investigating them, and then what are we doing specifically to respond to these threats? Claire, yes.
I think I can speak a little bit more to a student perspective. As many of you are aware, I believe this happened maybe back in December and January. There was a nationwide threat made on TikTok regarding school shootings. And a lot of our student population was scared that this was going to impact us. And how our administration handled it was they came over the loudspeaker at the end of the day and announced that the threat was not going to occur. It didn't apply to our school, not to be afraid. Well, this just completely inflamed everything that was going on. And I would say half of our student population did not show up to school the next day because they were afraid for their safety. And this was the same throughout the county. I'm not sure how it was around the state. I talked with other students around the county. And I think something that we need to focus on here is the specific response of administration within schools, because it was new. I don't think our administration necessarily knew how to handle it and how to break that news to students and reassure them that everything was going to be okay. And what they did was what they thought would be good to do, but it really just created a lot of unnecessary panic that wasn't there before. So in terms of that instance and just taking away from that, I think we really need to focus on specific instruction to administration and staff in terms of addressing concerns that arise on social media within schools to students to not increase panic further.
Thank you, Claire. Pam? Pam, you have your hand up, but I think you're on mute.
I'm sorry, I'm on my phone and I couldn't navigate back to the screen. I just wanted to piggyback a little bit. I agree. There was a difference in administrative decisions of how to address the threats itself. And as a parent, and I have 2 high schoolers in 2 different high schools, I think I would have felt a little more comfortable had there been some sort of uniformity within the response. I mean, I wouldn't have been opposed to the same message from both principals in that sense. So I think in a manner this, sometimes, as much as I hate scripted responses, so forth, but I think some of the trainings or some of the directives that we hope for, it has to go beyond us and administration as well to do the same thing. And in response to the school shooting threat. And then again, we know we've had it again this past week with the HBCUs, even 3 in Maryland haven't had been threatened. So I just think a little bit more in there, just think a little bit higher up the chain when it comes to the actual school system. Think above the administration, think of the leadership itself.
Thank you, Pam. Dr. Arlotto?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I guess I'm looking for a little clarification. The observation 8 talks about social media threats or posts, but the recommendation is more specific to threats made against schools. And there's certainly some unrealistic expectations, particularly of parents, about what schools and law enforcement can do around social media posts and threats as it relates to their children directly, or groups of children, versus the school itself. So I was looking for a little clarification on that.
That's a great question, or a great comment. So in the discussion, I think it was both. So the conversation went around these posts that are specific to a school, so a threat made to a specific school, and then what Claire was speaking to on the December incident, which was more of a general, not targeted, the post was not, or post not targeted to an individual school, and just general, a general threat made on social media that could have been for any school. So would it be helpful to separate those two out?
I think so. I mean, are we talking about bullying that's occurring on social media, and what the schools can do or not do, and law enforcement included, as it relates to social media? Threats to the school are different, and there are processes and protocols that we go through to try and run those down, their legitimacy, the level of threat, those things. But I think there's some real confusion as to, what we're able to do, what the schools are able to do to support students that may be being threatened or bullied on social media.
So the conversation from December was specific to, was not bullying related. It was specific to threats to the school. I don't even think it was threats to students. I would have to go back and review the video. I don't think there was a comment related to a threat to a particular individual. It was specific to the school itself. Dawn?
Yeah, I was going to say, I listening to Dr. Arlotto, I totally get what you're saying. And oftentimes parents, they'll contact the school first because they don't know, well, what can I do to have the social media company take this down, or where do I even start, right? So they're going to the school, and the schools are already busy with all of that. Obviously, they can fill out a bullying harassment form, which they can do through the school. So maybe something that the center could do would be sort of to walk through that and go over Grace's Law and Grace's Law 2.0, and understand how to walk a parent through that, and include contact information for the various social media companies, so that parents then have a resource for where to go in order to have that stuff taken down.
So that sounds like a separate recommendation. So you're speaking specifically to the bullying incidents of individuals online.
Right. So, when that gets conflated, obviously the mass violence issue is a huge one. Individual targeting is also an incredibly big one. Sometimes it's the same people doing both. And so, we have to have a way that's easier for students themselves even to self-advocate, that's empowering, on how to get Instagram or how to get TikTok to remove something that's offensive. And it's another opportunity to, market the Safe Schools Maryland tip line as well. Right.
Great, thank you. Detective Smith?
Yes, ma'am. Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, just to piggyback a couple of things that Dawn was saying that I just wanted to bring some light to. One thing about when you're talking about these bullying and threats on these social media sites, number one, the social media sites, they're really like gangsters with it. They only deal with law enforcement. That's one. And they only entertain taking down threats. So I know one thing that we do here in the city, and that's one thing that comes under my purview is, I tell you, a lot of times, when it's a threat, imminent danger, they'll remove it immediately. But when you're talking about bullying, harassments, and things like that, when you're talking about the Facebook, which on Instagram, and the other companies, they're not even really want to touch the bullying thing. You have to get parents and everybody will have to, ask a law enforcement officer to obtain subpoenas, and judges got to sign, and it's things like that. You really talk about how deep you want to get into this. So it's really, a tough task when you're going after these social media companies, when you're just talking about just bullying alone and things that are put up on social media.
All right, thank you, Detective. Karen?
I guess I just have one question. So I totally agree with Dr. Arlotto and Dawn on the bullying aspect of all of this. But to Pam's point and Claire's point, when the national threat came out on TikTok over the violence in the schools, I guess I'm questioning why, and I don't know if it's the Center for School Safety's role in order to implement the communications with the parents. I mean, to me, that's a central office duty coming from each of the respective counties. When it happened down here, we sent out a letter saying we're investigating it. We sent out a follow-up letter. The sheriff's office looked into it. This is where they were based, and A, B, C, D, and E, in order to put everyone at ease. So, I understand the need for some standardization, but at the same time, I think the school systems have to sit up and take some responsibility for this on their own, and put their own policies and actions into place when events like this happen, because I'm sure that's not going to be the first, last, and only one that we have in the upcoming months and years.
Yes, and I would agree. It should be the school systems that are speaking to the parents when these issues come out. So one of the things for that particular incident that we did is we coordinated with the school safety coordinating group that we have. But are there other, specifically for the public schools, private and non-public, are there other things that would be beneficial or helpful when those sort of trends are coming out or taking place? Okay, hearing none. The next recommendation is, so Coach Bell, I think this was originally one of your observations, which is the gap between safe schools or safe schools buildings and safe communities, limited capacity to provide students with a continuum of community-based interventions. The 9.1 new recommendation, which was added following December's meeting, explore creative solutions to expand safe after-school activities, which include transportation. So that was where the conversation was in December. What does that look like? What does implementation of that look like? Coach?
I mean, that's definitely something that we need to keep them off the street. So there is going to be something in there where we're probably going to have to look at getting people either volunteer or paying individuals to stay afterwards. We also probably looking at, like I said, the transportation part, and probably something of a meal of some type, helping, for the students if they're going to be staying there afterwards. But in the long run, I think it's worth it if we can keep them on campus. It's a lot safer than sometimes letting them go home to their neighborhoods. So I think it's a high priority. I think there is going to be some kind of funding. The only thing we have to really look at, I've seen some after school programs that probably shouldn't exist, so we have to be careful on how we get the grant for each school or each school system or how they apply. I think there might be some guidelines need to put in place on, okay, if you want this, this is what you have to provide. Obviously, you have to have a measurable, a measuring stick of success, and there's different ways of doing that. I think that's a conversation you need to have of how do you measure the success of an after school program? Because sometimes it's not as easy saying these grades have gotten better or behaviors down. Sometimes there's smaller things that are making after school programs successful, which and what they're not doing outside the school. So you definitely have to have that. Just having the support and then be able to have the knowledge to piggyback off of other programs, because it's much easier, I think, if you can tie programs in from elementary to middle to high school, because now those same individuals will have a consistent path or a consistent helpline that they can follow versus, middle school, you did X program, and then in high school, they have Y program. And now the student doesn't even realize those two programs are very similar because they have different names. They're just like, okay, I'm not going to do the high school program because I don't know what it's about. So I think there's got to be a connection between all school levels. And being able to reach out to community and getting them involved in the help so that our individual students understand they have a lot of resources they can go to for help.
Great, thank you, James. Nick?
Just to piggyback off of Coach Bell, all of our school systems throughout Maryland are implementing as part of our recovery from the pandemic, as well as the blueprint implementation, extended learning opportunities for students. We're required to do it at least this summer and then again next school year. An idea just to piggyback off of what Coach Bell was saying is maybe something around best practices to help support some after school programming or extended school programming that connects the academic along with that social, emotional, behavioral piece. There's a lot of language about connecting the ELOs that we're doing with community resources and partners, but maybe some tips or strategies for systems on how to do that in a productive way that meets the needs of our kids. I think long term could be a great opportunity for us.
Great, thank you. Any other input, comments? All right, we have two left. Number 10 is need funding for physical security upgrades, replacement and additions on buses and in schools, includes cameras, fencing, access control. So the new recommendation, again, this was sort of combining all of the comments from the last meeting, is to continue to provide public and private schools with access to funding to address physical security and equipment upgrades. So those, the bullets within the slide that you see are some of the original recommendations. We rolled all of these up into recommendation 10.1. So my first comment is there any concerns with that? Obviously there are, this is much bigger than saying, yes, we need more money, right? We go back to the comment about what funding for what are we, what sort of equipment and materials are we attempting to fund here? Are we replacing items? Are we adding new items? But does this recommendation as it's written now align with your conversations you had in December? That the need for funding for security upgrades still exists regardless of the type of school. Okay, good. And that will tie into the earlier recommendation of that assessment, or what are the minimum what's the guidance for minimum standards, and then how close are our schools to those standards. So the last one was related to the SRO grant. So this was modified given, and I don't think, I know Sheriff Adams wasn't able to get on, but I don't think Chief Kuiper was able to get on either. But this was specific to the SRO grant and the way that the legislation is worded. So the recommendation in December was to bring together local law enforcement agencies and school systems to review the Safe to Learn Act grant language and discuss potential amendments to the statute. Potentially develop the development of a grant regulation through the subcabinet, or make grant administrative changes. In other words, how we administer the grant. So I realize neither of them are here, and they were the two that were speaking about this directly, but from the public school side, Dr. Relato, I don't know if this would meet or help Anne Arundel County at all, or if this meets this would meet the need of the school systems relative to this particular grant.
Well, I think we are, Anne Arundel County used us as an example. Of course, our SROs are supplied to us through our county government and our local police department. So they're the funding source. If the desire is to review the language in the grant to look for different ways to spend the money, is that what this is suggesting? That the school systems, both public and private, have access to?
So I think that was definitely a part of it, but that was not the entire premise. So we have school systems that are currently not using some or all of the funding for various reasons, right? Whether it's inability to hire, they just don't have the ability to take out personnel that are already working in certain areas and move them over to be school resource officers. Not a hiring grant, so that's a challenge with the funding. There were also, there's some administrative challenges by some school systems. They just don't have the grant management personnel to be able to balance, you know, who's gonna be the one to submit for the grant and then who's gonna actually manage the grant. And I think, Dr. Relato, I think this also came up from the survey that you did with the local superintendents as well. So if this is aligns with the conversation in December, as you all remember it, again, I realize the two primary individuals aren't here. I can circle back with them. If this, the way we drafted this recommendation, if that meets the need.
From my vantage point, I think it does.
Okay. All right, great. So Dr. Relato, I will turn it back to you. That was the last recommendation. My hope is to have a draft developed for the next meeting, which is in March. And again, that's a draft of the report, which will include a lot more details than just the observation and recommendations on the slides.
Fantastic. Oh, just checking on you. Thank you, Kate. Well done. Thank you for walking us through that. Thank you, everybody, for the comments. We're just a couple minutes ahead of schedule. Dawn, I know you had mentioned a legislative update. My guess is you probably can't be as thorough as you would like in 7 minutes or less. So why don't we put that on the agenda for next meeting, where you could give us a little more thorough update on related legislation, if that's okay.
Sounds good.
Fantastic. Anything for the good of the order, anything that we didn't get to, and that was pretty exhaustive, Kate. Thank you. Not seeing any hands. Fantastic. Well, thank you, everybody. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Thank you, Delegate Eversole. A second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Nick. Would we like to discuss adjournment? I didn't think so. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Fantastic. You all are wonderful. We are adjourned. Thank you very much. Be safe, everybody.
You too. Bye.